Leonard Nimoy's Star Trek 2009 role created a glaring cast problem I'm more than happy to accept. Leonard Nimoy's presence as Spock in J.J. Abrams' 2009 Star Trek movie is the project's biggest connection to the sci-fi saga's Prime universe. And although he's a brilliant addition to the Star Trek 2009 cast, Abrams' choice to include the franchise legend also poked a big hole in the logic of the Kelvin timeline. That being said, it's an issue that I am content with ignoring, as I really like the reboot movies, and the canonical blind spot doesn't massively harm the story being told. If it did, I might feel slightly differently about the narrative dissonance caused. After playing Spock as part of Star Trek, the original series cast, Nimoy reprised his role when he returned to voice the Vulcan in Star Trek, the animated series. He also went on to embody the character in 6 movies alongside the cast of the show that started it all. However, the end of the TOS-era Star Trek movies wasn't the final time the actor would return as Spock. Despite the character largely belonging to Zachary Quinto in the 2009 soft reboot, Nimoy starred in the same movie as the Prime version of the Vulcan. It was cool, but imperfect. The introduction of Leonard Nimoy as Spock in 2009 Star Trek made the newer cast harder to accept. When Star Trek was released in 2009, the franchise had been inert since Star Trek Enterprise had ended in 2005. As such, the J.J. Abrams project was largely being marketed as a hard reboot of the franchise that was more a tribute to Star Trek, the original series, rather than having canonical ties. Every character was recast, which strengthened the impression that the movie was leaving the past in the past. Abrams' decision to bring back Nimoy as Prime Spock in the same movie where Quinto had already replaced him sort of undid the creative overhaul. However, Abrams' decision to set the movie in an alternate timeline set in motion by the destruction of the USS Kelvin meant the 2009 effort was simply the beginning of a new in-universe Star Trek reality. I still think this was an incredibly respectful way of paying homage to the Prime universe without changing or retconning anything from the larger franchise. That being said, Abrams' decision to bring back Nimoy as Prime Spock in the same movie where Quinto had already replaced him sort of undid the creative overhaul. Spock's birth date is the same in the Prime universe and the Kelvin timeline. So, when the USS Kelvin was destroyed and the new timeline came into existence, Spock had already been born in both realities. Therefore, Spock should really look like Leonard Nimoy in the 2009 effort, not like Quinto. Without Nimoy in the cast, this would have been an easier quirk to ignore, but seeing both actors in the same place highlights how borderline nonsensical it is. This also applies to the other recastings, like Chris Pine taking William Shatner's place as Captain Kirk. Introducing Nimoy's Spock to the Kelvin timeline was too cool not to do. When J.J. Abrams rebooted Star Trek in 2009, he did more than just reimagine the Enterprise for a new generation. He did the unthinkable. He brought Leonard Nimoy back to the screen as Spock. In an alternate timeline film packed with young, fresh-faced actors and lens flares brighter than a supernova, Nimoy's return stood like a monolith. It was a poetic nod to the franchise's roots, but it also created a problem so glaring that it nearly cracked the film's internal logic. And I loved every second of it. At its core, the problem is this: the moment Leonard Nimoy appeared as Spock Prime, the new cast could no longer fully own their roles. His presence essentially whispered to the audience, "These young actors are not the originals, and here's proof." It undermined the reboot's illusion of self-containment. Instead of boldly going into a clean slate future, it anchored the film irrevocably to the past. This wasn't just a nostalgic cameo. It was a cosmic endorsement, a celestial thumbs up that blessed the new timeline, even as it robbed it of its narrative independence. Nimoy's Spock didn't just make an appearance. He brought the weight of Star Trek's mythos with him. And suddenly, Chris Pine's Kirk, Zachary Quinto's Spock, and Carl Urban's Bones weren't just characters, they were successors. The problem, original versus replacement, reboots live or die by their ability to convince audiences that their new versions are worth investing in. Whether it's Batman Begins or Casino Royale, the audience needs to forget what came before, at least for a little while. But by having Leonard Nimoy's Spock step into the frame, Star Trek 2009 made it impossible to forget. It's like watching a school play where, halfway through, the real Hamlet shows up and delivers a monologue. The audience applauds. The students try to continue, but we all know who truly stole the show. Nimoy's presence drew a line in the stars. There was the real Spock, and then there was this new one. It made it harder, at least initially, for Quinto's version to truly feel like his own. But here's the twist, that very imbalance became the beating heart of the film. And that's why I'm more than happy to accept this problem. Why it works. First, it's important to understand that Star Trek is not your average franchise. This is a saga built on ideas, on continuity, on the exploration of identity and legacy. By embracing its own past rather than rejecting it, the reboot offered something rare in Hollywood: respect. Leonard Nimoy's presence wasn't just an Easter egg for longtime fans, it was a narrative cornerstone. His role as Spock Prime wasn't superficial. It was an emotional anchor, a narrative guidepost, and a torch-passing ceremony all rolled into one. In fact, it's hard to imagine the film working quite as well without him. Without Nimoy's Spock, the new cast might have seemed like imposters. With him, they became chosen heirs. His presence said, "This is different, yes, but it matters." It reframed the story not as a do-over, but as a continuation, albeit on a divergent path. The emotional payoff. Leonard Nimoy's scenes in Star Trek 2009 are deeply moving because they play on layers of memory. When he tells young Kirk about his friendship with the other you, or when he meets his younger self and gently counsels him, it hits with a kind of emotional weight that few reboots have ever dared to chase. It's not just nostalgia, it's an earned emotion, a tribute to decades of storytelling. Think about that moment when Spock Prime raises his hood and reveals his face. There's a hush, an electricity. For longtime fans, it's like seeing a long-lost friend step out of a time machine. For new viewers, it's an invitation into something much larger than just another sci-fi spectacle. It even makes the cast better. Here's the paradox. While Nimoy's presence does undercut the idea that these new actors are the definitive versions, it also elevates them. By interacting with the original Spock, Zachary Quinto's Spock gains layers he otherwise couldn't. He doesn't have to mimic Nimoy, he just has to exist in dialogue with him. That alone deepens his performance. The same goes for Chris Pine's Kirk. His arc gains a mythic dimension precisely because we know the shadow he's stepping into. Bones, Uhura, Sulu, and Scotty all benefit by contrast. They're not replacements, they're echoes, distortions, reinventions. And the film leans into that. Instead of pretending that nothing came before, Star Trek 2009 builds its very identity around what came before. The result is a film that celebrates evolution rather than imitation. It doesn't try to erase the past, it writes a new chapter next to it. Legacy greater than logic. From a purely logical standpoint, sure, bringing Nimoy in breaks the immersion. It yanks you out of the new timeline and says, remember the old days? But Star Trek has never been about pure logic, ironically, considering Spock's heritage. It's about heart. It's about connection. And it's about finding humanity even in the most alien of places. Leonard Nimoy's return was the emotional glue that held the new universe together. Without him, the reboot might have succeeded as a slick, action-packed sci-fi romp. With him, it became a love letter. And in doing so, it turned a glaring problem into